Mosaic is brought to you in part by these generous corporate sponsors. Learn how you can support Mosaic by visiting jewishpb.org/mosaic.
Welcome to Mosaic. I'm your host, Susan Schulman-Pertnoy. Mosaic is Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County's weekly news magazine, exploring the most critical issues facing Jews here and around the world. He grew up the son of a Holocaust survivor, leading protest marches all over the world. Today, he's an award-winning journalist and best-selling author, leading efforts to bridge the divides between Jews and other communities. Yossi Klein Halevi is our guest. We'll be right back. Joining us today is Yossi Klein Halevi. You are a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. You co-direct the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative. You're an award-winning journalist and best-selling author. We are so delighted to welcome you to Mosaic today.
Thank you so much for having me, Sue.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. Yossi, you were born in Brooklyn and you're a child of a Holocaust survivor. How did that shape your life?
I can't conceive of myself without that biographical detail. For me, it is the foundation, really, of who I am as a Jew, certainly, and I think to a large extent who I am as a person as well. You know, it's an amazing thing. I try to explain this to my kids sometimes, that when I was growing up, the Holocaust was barely 2 decades away. Today the Holocaust is World War I. What World War I was like for my generation, the Holocaust is even more removed, 70 years. And but growing up not just in such proximity to the time, but with such intimacy in family context, that it really shaped my whole being. You know, I grew up obsessed with the Holocaust. I think that was very much a generational response. Certainly those of us who grew up in survivor families, this was a burden that we had to unpack. You couldn't just leave it sitting there. You had to do something. I had friends who became doctors, and I think they became doctors because there was this need to try to respond to this of death by serving life. My response was to become really a full-time Jew, a full-time Jewish activist from when I was a kid. I joined the Soviet Jewry movement, which had just begun. This is going back to 1965, really in the earliest baby step.
You were very young to it at that point, too.
I was 12. And when I discovered the Soviet Jewry movement, it was like, this is how I can respond to the Holocaust. And it became very much internalized in the sense that I'm going to do for the last remaining Jews of Eastern Europe what the previous generation of American Jewry failed to do for my parents' generation. And so we became, and I think this was very much a generational response, we saw ourselves in some ways as retroactively trying to save the Jews of Holland. So I became really a full-time activist. High school is a blur. I was out on the streets demonstrating literally day and night at the Soviet Union, at the UN, and in and out of jail, and sit downs, and at one point a group of us went to the Soviet Union. This was in 1973. I was 19, and we staged a sitting at the emigration office in Moscow, and we were arrested in Moscow. So this was my life, and I think I was self-aware enough at the time, and I certainly see this now very clearly, to make the connection between what I was doing then and the circumstances. So yeah, it defined me, it shaped me, and it gave me a tremendous amount of energy and determination, and a real force to my Jewish life.
Why did you make Aliyah?
Well, I think that it goes back to that experience to some extent as well, but it's not only, or maybe even primarily, the experience of the Holocaust, of growing up in a surviving family, although I'm sure. But I think it was the deep involvement with the Soviet Union. My generation was the generation of the ingathering. The struggle of the Soviet Jewry movement was, in a sense, to complete the final stage of ingathering those parts of the Jewish people that were forbidden to move to Israel. And being so immersed in the struggle of other Jews to move to Israel, and seeing what they were sacrificing, standing up to the most powerful totalitarian regime in history, and being ready to take the consequences. I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to be part of it through the Soviet Jewry movement. But more deeply, I think I really wanted to be part of this moment. And what I always felt growing up was that if I have the opportunity to actually live in Israel, why would I want to be anywhere else? And that experience was also, or that conclusion was reinforced by a seminal experience that I had when I was 14, summer of 1967, right after 1964. My father and I went to Israel first time. And my father had two brothers living in Israel who had survived the war, and we hadn't seen since he came to America, to Israel. And right after the end of the Six-Day War, he said to me, "That's it, we're going." And in those years, travel was very, very limited. You didn't just get on a plane. It was a really unusual experience, so much so that all my friends showed up, went to the airport. They accompanied me to the airport.
Oh my goodness.
When I got on the plane, and they were all there to greet me when I came back 2 months later. I was the first among my friends to go to Israel. And to be in Israel in the summer of '67 was really to see the most beautiful and charming side of Israel.
I'm sure.
It was. I often compare my relationship with Israel, falling in love with this beautiful woman, marrying, and then being confronted with a fine print
This is a great story, and we have to take our first break. We'll be right back after this brief message. Coming up, how Yossi Klein Halevi evolved from a self-described extremist to a person of great empathy.
Join adults in the Palm Beaches who are finding meaning behind the texts at the root of Judaism. Federation's Commission for Jewish Education is connecting adult learners with the life-enhancing Melton School of Adult Jewish Learning that nurtures and deepens our Jewish community worldwide. Learn more at jewishpb.org/Melton.
We're back with Yossi, and he was talking about his journey to Israel in 1968. But when did you actually make Aliyah?
In 1982, the summer of 82, which was the antithetical moment to the summer of 67. Summer of 67 was the celebration of Israel's victory. Israel could do no wrong in the summer. The summer of 82 was the beginning of what we now call the First Lebanon War. Sabra and Shatila massacre happened a few weeks after I made Aliyah. Israel was a deeply divided society that summer. And we were divided over precisely what had unified us in the past, which was security situation, war. We were divided over whether we should have invaded Lebanon. And Israelis were shouting at each other in the streets. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, this is my Aliyah. This is my homecoming. And come on, guys, where's that spirit of the summer of 67? And I very quickly realized that I wasn't in Kansas anymore. And it's a different Israel. I really had to very quickly readjust and deal with a much more complicated reality than Israel seemed to be in the summer of 67.
You once described yourself as a Jewish extremist. And how did somebody go from being from one end of the spectrum to what you are today as a man of great empathy?
Well, it's interesting because, it goes back, Susan, to your first question, which is how did the Shoah. And at one point, I made the transition from the mainstream Soviet Jewry movement, which was peaceful, legal, very respectable, to switching to the fringe of the movement, which was headed by Kahana, the Jewish Defense League, a movement that was explicitly embraced violence. And when you're 17, 18, that can be very heavy. And Kahana gave expression to the rage that I felt for the whole world. I felt that the whole world had in some ways collaborated in the destruction of Jews of Europe. And I would have a much more nuanced view today, but certainly when I was a teenager, I felt that I was at war with the world. And Kahana gave that expression. And it's a long story about I'd say how I deprogrammed from that mentality of us versus them, of seeing rage as the best part of myself, most idealistic part of myself, to beginning to realize that rage might be the most problematic part of myself. And in general, I think that the way that spiritual work happens on oneself is that you reach a point where you realize that certain qualities in yourself that you always thought were really positive qualities. But what was very important for me, though, was not to go from one extreme to the other, not to move from the far right to the far left. And there is that tendency, certain extremist personality. You can see people making that move in either direction. You know, prominent people from the 60s, who were very left-wing in the 60s, then became prominent Trump supporters. Or the opposite, people who, like myself, and then embrace the far left. And it was very important for me to find my place in the center. And today, I would define myself very much as a militant centrist. I believe that the center has to be strengthened. The center is the place of diversity, where the two sides of the shouting match can be heard, where the insights of each camp can be examined and honored. And I think that certainly in the Jewish context, the Israeli context, it's crucial for our ability to maintain cohesiveness as a people, to strengthen the center where different ways of expressing our Jewishness.
Well, also I think it's really served you well to because you went through all that in your work with the Palestinians. I think you have an understanding and you know how to work with both sides because you've seen the extreme, and now you've been able. It's taught you how to be empathetic to so many other points of view. So I think that's a very powerful tool.
I appreciate that.
And I, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please finish.
No, I wanted to ask you about your work. In the 1990s, you went and immersed yourself in the Muslim and Christian world. Can you talk about why you did that?
Yeah, in the late 1990s, it was just before the collapse of the Oslo peace process. I was, as it was, I think, to most Israelis at that point, that the Oslo process was failed, that Yasser Arafat was not a real peace partner, and that and the wrong partner. But I felt that there needs to be something that I, as an Israeli citizen, can do to try to further the possibilities in the long term of Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation. And I went on a year-long journey into Palestinian Islam and Palestinian Christianity, into the faiths of my neighbors in this land. And it was a pilgrimage. I wanted to learn something of their inner devotional lives. I wanted to hear their stories. I wanted to hear the Palestinian narrative. I wanted to be able to sit in a mosque in the West Bank, even in Gaza. Today it's now inconceivable. But I actually did participate up in the mosque in a refugee camp where I actually served as a soldier a few years earlier. And I wanted to see how far I could take this relationship. How I understood that there were built-in limitations. I wanted to push the envelope. And I wrote a book about the journey.
Yes, you did. We're going to talk about your books after this brief. We have to take another break, so we're going to talk about your book after this brief message. Thank you. Coming up, author Yossi Klein Halevi talks about his New York Times best-selling book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and how it's changing the narrative on both sides. We're back with Yossi Klein Halevi, and he's telling us about his extraordinary experience living amongst the Muslim world, and it inspired you to write your book, and you were about to say.
Now, the book is called At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, and it has one of the longest subtitles of any book that I've ever wrote. A Jew's search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land. And the book came out at a very unfortunate moment. Publication date was September 11th, 2001.
Ooh.
And so the book really got understandably sidelined by the overwhelming news at that time. And but the book was for me, it was a kind of a precursor to the work that I'm doing now.
And you've done incredible work now, and I want to talk about this best-selling book called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. It was published in 2018 and then republished in paperback a year later with an extensive epilogue. Now, this is where this is amazing, of Palestinian responses. How did you come up with this idea?
You know, it was really an evolving project. It began, as you pointed out, 20 years earlier on this pilgrimage into Palestinian society. And the purpose of that pilgrimage was to learn, to listen to my neighbors. This book, in some sense, is a sequel to that journey. Because in this book, I'm trying to explain to my neighbor. You listen to my neighbor. Now I want to explain to my neighbor who I am, what my story is, who the Jewish people are, why we came home, why we believe this is home. And it's really a book about Zionism for a very difficult audience for that topic. You can't think of a harder audience than the Palestinians to write about Zionism, but I felt that after 100 years of conflict, there needs to be an Israeli writer to take this on, to turn directly to our neighbors and say, listen, we have a story. We belong here. You belong here. You are indigenous to this land. So are we. And here's why I believe that that's so.
Tell us a response that stood out to you.
Well, when the book was first published, I wrote about it on Facebook, and I got a response from a Palestinian who I didn't know. And he writes me saying, so what are you going to tell your Palestinian neighbor? Are you going to tell us why occupation is in our best interest? So I wrote him back, and this is all on Facebook. I wrote him back saying, I'm hoping to start a different kind of conversation between us. And he immediately responds, apologizing for his tone. And I thought, whoa, that's a turnaround. I didn't expect to get that quick a positive response. So I wrote him back saying, tell me something about yourself. If it's at all possible, maybe we can meet. And he writes me back saying he grew up in a refugee camp in Lebanon, and now he lives in Australia. I said, okay, let's Skype. So we did, And it turns out that he is a BDS activist in Australia. And he, of course, Googled me before we Skyped. I've written extensively against BDS. And we had a terrific conversation. And I asked him whether he would honor me by reading this book. It was still in galley form. I sent the book to him, and he wrote me a long letter in response. The letter was very complicated. He said there were parts of this book that I absolutely hated. There were parts of this book that were intriguing. There were parts of this book that were a learning experience for me. Parts of this book that I'm not sure. And he elaborated.
Has anybody written to you about a perspective that you had never thought of yourself?
You know, being involved in this conflict for so many years, as a journalist, as a writer, as a soldier, as a citizen, as a reconciliation activist, so many different and even opposing perspectives, doesn't leave a lot of room for being surprised by some new idea. The ideas that we debate here on this conflict are so shop-worn that it's really hard to come up with something. Well, what this process did for me was it changed me. It didn't necessarily change my opinions, but it changed my meeting Palestinians, forcing myself to pay attention again to what's happening in Palestinian society. After for years being so angry with Palestinian leaders because of the terrorism, the rejection of Israel's peace offers during the Camp David, this sense of which so many Israelis feel today, I think understandably, which is, I'm fed up. I don't want to hear about Palestinians. Being in deep communication with Palestinians has deprived me of the luxury of not seeing. And I have to see again. I have to be engaged with Palestinian suffering, with the Palestinian suffering. And yes, I have my critique of the responsibility of Palestinian leaders for much of their tragedy. It's not all on them. Some of it is certainly on us, but enough of it is on them so that I'm not walking around feeling guilty. Yeah. But you know, there seem to be two positions in the Jewish community today. You're either left-wing and you're beating your breast and you feel so guilty about the occupation, or you're right-wing and you're beating the Palestinian breast and you're pointing your finger, it's all your fault. And what I tried to do in this book was to sidestep those two modes of right and left and present a centrist Israeli perspective where I feel empathy for Palestinians, but I stand firmly and proudly in the Zionist story.
On that note, we have to end the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, truly a pleasure. Thank you.